Welcome back to my course, History of Socialism. Today the topic of our conversation will be two personalities or two political positions within the same ideology, Stalin and Trotsky. So we talked about in early lectures about the victory of the Bolshevik regime that declared itself communist in 1917. Last time we talked about those marginal people who tried to question the validity of this ideology and the whole concept of socialism. We also concluded that the majority of the mainstream actually sympathized with socialism or with socialism-like reforms. Okay, it was on the minds of the people east and west. Of course, Russian Bolsheviks / communists, they went to the extreme, trying to nationalize the entire industry, abolish money, abolish trade, okay, putting all factories and industrial facilities under the control of the Bolshevik government. In Western Europe, it was done on a limited scale, or social democrats wanted the same thing, only in a moderate way. Okay, nationalization of the commanding heights. Okay. Today, we are going to talk about more about the Bolshevik experiment. So how it developed in time and space. Okay. In our lecture about Bolsheviks, Russian communists, we talked about war communism, these extreme reforms, quote unquote, the Bolsheviks accomplished, and how these quote unquote reforms led to economic disaster, famine. Today, we are going to discuss how the Bolshevik regime produced these two powerful personalities, Stalin and Trotsky, who was supported by particular factions in the Bolshevik / Communist Party, who had different visions of the Soviet Russia development. Again, they were unanimous about the whole socialism project. They were members of the same party, united by the discipline. Okay, remember, vanguard communist party, that was the concept put forward by Lenin. Mobilized, disciplined group of revolutionaries, professional revolutionaries, the vanguard that navigated working class people to the bright future. But as soon as these Bolsheviks came to power, they unavoidably started to clash with each other. Okay, all other parties were forbidden. Remember, no political opposition was allowed outside of the Bolshevik party. All opposition newspapers were shut down because it was a dictatorship, which Bolsheviks called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Remember, Bolshevik positioned themselves as the enlightened masters who acted on behalf of the proletariat, or in other words, on behalf of the industrial working class people, the salt of the earth, these noble savages of classical Marxism who were expected to redeem the world from oppression. So the Bolsheviks claimed that they acted on behalf of the working class people, but in reality, what we have after 1917, it was the dictatorship of the Bolshevik party that renamed itself in 1919 into what? In the Communist Party. Remember, 1919, Bolsheviks officially accepted the name communism, and they also launched an organization that was called Comintern, or the Communist International. It was the alliance of Bolsheviks and different groups of socialist radicals who similarly renamed themselves into communists from different parts of the globe, from the United States to Japan. There were many groups of radicals who quit on social democratic parties and sided themselves with Bolsheviks, who argued that soon the world revolution, the world communist revolution would be coming. This worldwide Holocaust, as a result, revolutionary Holocaust, as a result of which bourgeoisie would be smashed, phased out, and the new society would prevail, okay, for the purposes of promotion of the communist revolution globally. Bolsheviks and their allies from different parts of the globe, they created so-called Comintern, or it's an abbreviation, the Communist International, okay. The center of Comintern was Moscow. The Bolsheviks were in charge of this international organization, and all regional branches of this organization, which formerly were called communist parties, but they were branches of Comintern, the Communist International. So they were expected to fulfill the orders coming from Moscow, and the goal was to work to sway their respective countries in the direction of turmoil. So to plant anarchy, turmoil, to instigate working class people, to revolt against the governments, and eventually to promote the communist revolution, okay? Because the expectation immediately in the wake of 1917 was that the world communist revolution would soon expand all over the world, okay? Russia was viewed, what before was called the Russian Empire, was viewed by Bolsheviks as the spark that was to ignite worldwide revolutionary Holocaust, okay? And the first countries to join, it was expected that the first countries to join this worldwide project would be Germany, France, Austria, so countries of Central, Western Europe, the most developed countries, then the United States, and then colonial periphery countries, okay? So all over the world. In this case, it was the fulfillment of what Karl Marx and Engels had to say. Remember, in classical Marxism, there was expectation that a communist revolution could not win in one country, in one separate country. Okay, Marx and Engels argued that a communist revolution wouldn't be able to win in one separate country. Why? Because this country, or this revolution, local revolution, would be squashed by evil surrounding, capitalist surrounding. So Marx and Engels argued that the communist revolution would be able to win simultaneously in the most developed countries where capitalism was ripe for the communist revolution. But remember, Bolshevik already made the first adjustment of classical Marxism to Russian realities. They said that Russia, in fact, even though she was a backward country, she was served as a trigger, as a jumping ground for the worldwide revolution, because in Russia, as Lenin argued in his book, Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in Russia, we have two sets of contradictions which worked well to instigate this revolt. The first set of contradictions, which Russia inherited from the previous socioeconomic formations, feudalism, when feudal lords and peasants clashed with each other, and the new set of contradictions between so-called capitalists and the proletariat, or working class people. So he said, look, in the current conditions, in contemporary conditions, Lenin argued, in fact, it was beneficial that Russia was a backward country because it was more explosive than the most developed countries of Europe or United States, where capitalism, yes, was ripe for the socialist revolution, but where we only have one set of contradictions between the capitalists and the proletariat. But in Russia, we have two sets of contradictions. So this country would be like a spark, okay? And then revolution immediately should go to Germany, Austria, France, UK, and then to the United States. Okay, that was the expectation. And remember, originally there was some kind of ground for these naive expectations of the Bolsheviks, because in a few European countries we did have attempts to replicate the Bolshevik coup d'etat. And last time, before we discussed this debate about socialist calculation, I even mentioned you the countries where, particular countries where radical socialists tried to replicate the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. It was Hungary, it was Finland, it was several times in Germany, okay? But all these attempts failed, okay? And also an attempt of Bolsheviks to use the Red Army to bring a revolution to Europe also failed, because in 1920 Bolsheviks sent Red Army troops to Poland. The expectation was that by smashing the Polish quote-unquote capitalist state, a Red Army would be joined by the Polish workers, and together they would go to Germany to help the German Revolution, okay? Because Germany was the cradle of the organized socialist movement, so Bolsheviks gambled on Germany very much. But this attempt to use the Red Army miserably failed, because the Polish people joined their quote-unquote capitalists, exploiters, and stood as a wall in front of the Red Army. So decided to sacrifice themselves for the new Polish nation that was able to consolidate herself into a state, okay, in the wake of this collapse of the Russian Empire. So Poland was able to reconstitute herself as an independent state, and the Polish so-called quote-unquote exploited masses were ready to fight to death against Red Army, okay, because they viewed the Red Army as the Russian imperialists who wanted to squash their nationalism, their national aspirations. See, Bolsheviks underestimated the nationalistic sentiments. So history proved that national sentiments were more powerful than class sentiments, because remember Lenin, Luxemburg, they gambled on class sentiments. They said that we would be able to turn World War I, this war of nation against other nations, would be able to turn this war, World War I, into a civil war of classes, the exploited classes, okay, workers and peasants, against oppressors, quote unquote, people who were singled out by radical socialists as exploiters, middle class people, so-called bourgeoisie, merchants, and so forth. Okay. Anyway, the failure of Bolshevik campaign in 1920, Red Army campaign to bring revolution to Europe, showed that national sentiments were more powerful than class sentiments. But still, among Bolsheviks, among these, they were ideologists, Bolsheviks, who believed that revolution would come soon. There was still powerful ideological expectation. There would be revolution. Okay. But I repeat, the failures of European attempts to replicate the Bolshevik experience, the failure of Bolsheviks to use the Red Army to bring the revolution to Europe, was like a cold shower for some ideologists in the Bolshevik party, and they started to question their own blueprint, this blueprint of the world revolution. And that's what's important for us today, for our discussion. So it was this long introduction. we need to keep this in mind, what I just said, in order to have what? A context to understand the debates between Stalin and Trotsky, two powerful leaders within the Bolshevik Party who contested the leadership. We are going to talk about Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. We're going to discuss the project Stalin came up with called Socialism in One Country, and how he tried to cast his project against what Leon Trotsky offered, which can be called the project of the world revolution, because Trotsky was hooked on this classical Marxism. So Trotsky wanted to stick to the books, sacred books of Marxism. So we need to stick to the books of Marxism. We need to railroad revolution all over the world. Okay. Stalin decided to adjust classical Marxism to the Russian soil. Okay, and he started talking about socialism in one country. Before we do this, we need to briefly outline how the Bolshevik state developed. I will start, you see this slide, and I would like to start from the end. So look at the last bullet point, Lenin dies. So Lenin suffered from a few strokes. He didn't live a long life. Lenin was the chief of the Bolshevik regime, remember? 1924, he dies, and when the chief of dictatorship dies, you know, his successors always begin to fight for power. So Russia, socialist Russia, was not an exception in this case. There were two powerful men after Lenin died who started to contest each other power: Stalin and Trotsky. And to be specific, Trotsky was the most popular man after Lenin, okay, because Stalin was less visible. Trotsky was everywhere. His portraits were in offices of communist bureaucrats, schools, universities. Okay. What I would like to stress that when Lenin was alive, the Bolshevik regime already moved toward a totalitarian dictatorship. The reason I would like to emphasize this is that to the present day, among socialist true believers in the East and the West, you can Google it, there's this widespread fallacy that when Lenin was alive, the communist regime in Russia was nice, benign, okay, and Lenin encouraged debates. But when Stalin came to power, this nice left project, Lenin's project, was spoiled by this evil Stalin. So they tried to separate Lenin and Stalin. That's what they do. It's very popular among the left, I repeat, to the present day, to separate these two persons. Okay, they like they try to put emphasis on so-called differences. In fact, if you look into history, if you look at the evolution of the Bolshevik regime, you will see the continuity between Lenin and Stalin. Okay, when Lenin was alive, the Bolshevik regime already was moving fast forward toward a totalitarian dictatorship. Okay, first, as we know, the Bolshevik Party shut down all opposition parties, shut down freedom of press. Okay. Yes, when Lenin was alive, the Bolshevik regime was still comparatively vegetarian, quote unquote. Yeah, by saying vegetarian, it's a metaphor, of course. It was not so cannibalistic like it became under Stalin's rule later. Okay, but still, it was already a dictatorship. It was already an oppressive regime that never tolerated freedom of speech. Of course, it was out of question. Freedom of speech was penalized. In fact, freedom of speech was considered a bourgeois. Okay, so only the left viewpoint, and particularly Bolshevik viewpoint, was allowed. Okay. At the end of this month, on September 28th, there would be an anniversary of so-called Philosopher's Boat incident. It was the first nationwide campaign to shut down the dissent, the remaining dissent in the Soviet Russia. Okay. This incident, I repeat, became known as a Philosopher Boat. It's a landmark event, and I would like to emphasize this. Again, Lenin was still alive and active. What we have by 1922, we have in big Russian cities like Moscow, Petrograd, former St. Petersburg, Kazan, we have intellectuals, university professors, who still dared to question the Bolshevik or communism. Okay, we have, for example, professors who published a journal called Economist, where they criticized war communism, where they blamed the famine that took away more than 1.5 million people on the Bolshevik so-called reforms, shutting down trade, abolishing money, total nationalization. Okay, when they tried to tell the students, some of these professors tried to tell students about what was going on in Russia. And of course, even this limited dissent, I repeat, in universities, on the pages of journals, it's not some kind of widespread publications. It was not, it didn't fly with the Bolsheviks. They were very angry about this, so they didn't want to tolerate any dissent, like any radical left. They believe only their viewpoint should prevail. We know about this, okay? And in the past, in the present, again, radical left, they believe they know the key, they believe they know the way, okay? And there is no other way, it's only their way. So Bolsheviks were not an exception. So Lenin writes a letter to the chief of the secret police. Remember, I told you the name of the guy, Polish guy, a Polish professional revolutionary named Felix Jerzinski. You can see him here. He sits with Stalin. Okay, you can see this guy, Jerzinski. So this guy, he was a very committed Bolshevik. Remember, in his youth, he wanted to become a Catholic priest, but then changed his mind, became a die-hard atheist, and committed the radical socialist. After Bolsheviks won, he was put in charge of the secret police, Bolshevik secret police. And the secret police organized a Red Terror against the enemies of the revolution. So Lenin writes a letter to the chief of secret police where he says, we still see here and there a few names of some intellectuals and professors who question our reforms, who try to throw wrenches in our wheels. We need to shut them down. And Jerzinski responds to this. So secret police composed the list of the dangerous intellectuals who were speaking, who dared to speak against the Bolshevik regime. A few hundred intellectuals. So all of them were rounded up and questioned by the secret police and ordered to leave the Soviet Russia. Okay, see, at this point, Bolsheviks, and that is why I'm using the word vegetarian, at this point, the Bolshevik regime was still, quote-unquote, benign, so they were offered to leave Russia and never return. Okay, so these intellectuals, professors, they were actually forced to sign a document where they said that I agree to leave Russia. In case I return, I would be executed. Okay, university professors. Among these names, there were some big names. I can give you a few of them, which you might know since we're in the United States. For example, one of the founders of modern American sociology was a guy named Pitirim Sorokin. He was one of these professors who was kicked out from Soviet Russia, who moved to the United States, and here in 1930s, 1940s, 50s, he became one of the most prominent sociologists. Or Nicolas Berdyaev, another intellectual who became a famous philosopher in France. Okay. We have historians. We have economists like last time we mentioned names of Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. There was a Russian Jewish economist named Brutskus, who was also kicked out because he questioned the economics, the economic implications of the war communism. He was one of the major enemies. So the major part of these intellectuals were loaded in 1922 on a German boat named Bürgermeister Heiken. Bürgermeister Heiken, that was going to Hamburg, German city. So secret police escorted hundreds of intellectuals, put them on this boat, and shipped them away from Russia. Okay. By the way, this shipment, quote unquote, of intellectuals away from Russia was followed by a few other boats. There were a few other boats that sailed from the coastal cities of Russia in the Black Sea. Okay, but the major boat sailed away from Petrograd, St. Petersburg, to Hamburg, Germany, carrying away hundreds of intellectuals. Okay, it's important to keep in mind, because it shows how the regime, the Bolshevik regime, this leftist regime, gradually evolved toward totalitarian dictatorship. It didn't happen overnight. Okay. See, here we have the remnants of the opposition outside of the Bolshevik party being shut down. Okay. So in 1922, when this opposition was totally shut down and all these intellectuals were exiled on the Philosopher boat, we have a next stage. We have gradual shutting down opposition within the Bolshevik party. And in fact, it started in 1921, then continued in 1922, 1923. There were debates within the Bolshevik party. There were different groups within the Bolshevik party, even though there was discipline, but still, which way the regime should go. Remember, formally, the Bolshevik regime declared that all power should belong to the proletariat. So it means, formally, working collectives on the ground should control the factories. And that's what became the major argument of so-called workers' opposition within the Bolshevik party. There were some Bolsheviks. Again, I'm not giving you names. We have too many names. We have too many names. Just workers' opposition who said, look, yes, when we were fighting for power, it was the vanguard party. We were the vanguard party. It's important. But now, look, we hold the power. We don't want to be turned into huge bureaucracy. So let's fulfill our own pledge to give power to workers' collectives. So let workers elect whatever, managers, whatever. And Lenin, he was very mad, angry about this. He said, that's how we're going to disarm ourselves. So if you allow workers on the ground to debate things, to elect the managers, so we will not be able to consolidate our resources, how are we going to resist the capitalist surroundings? Because we are like an island of socialism within the sea of capitalism. So the country would be torn apart if you will be involved into this self-government of workers in the factories. So he actually shut down this workers' opposition, used his charisma to shut down. Okay, there was another faction within the Bolshevik Party that asked so-called democratic centralism. Democratic centralism faction actually said was a word how the workers' opposition was handled. So they were very much upset that one of the factions was shut down. They were not allowed to speak up because Lenin believed it was harmful for the cause of communism in Russia. So this democratic centralism faction said we should allow factions. They should exist in our Bolshevik or Communist Party on a permanent basis. And Lenin said, well, guys, it's dangerous because if we allow debates all the time, so we will shoot ourselves in the foot again. It would demoralize us. Okay, you cannot make one single plan. You cannot develop a centralized plan to do something in economics and politics because we will be involved in ongoing debates. See, again, it never crossed his mind that because he was a committed communist, it never crossed his mind that opposition should exist. Okay, he believed that he mastered the wisdom of Marxism. He knew the way, and the people like him, the majority in the Bolshevik Party, believed that they knew the way. And any debates, any people who questioned this or argued that we have our own Marxist way, okay, so they had to be shut down. And in fact, Lenin was able to mobilize the majority of the Bolshevik people within the party to shut down these minority people who said we should have factions within our party on a permanent basis. In fact, Lenin went even further. He made sure that this Bolshevik party adopted by the majority of votes a resolution that said no opposition should be allowed. And this resolution actually was adopted in 1921, as early as 1921. And throughout the 1920s, those people who tried to speak up or to question decisions issued by the leaders of the Bolshevik party were shut down. Okay, they said, oh, are you speaking against the party? You cannot be right against the party. So you have to listen to the leadership because it's the wisdom, collective wisdom of our party. So Lenin dies, and Stalin, by the way, he takes an oath. He takes an oath by the Lenin's grave. Lenin actually was buried in so-called mausoleum. It's like pyramid-like structure that was erected in Moscow. At first it was a wooden structure, then it was rebuilt into a marble structure, like a small Egyptian pyramid reminds, where Lenin's sarcophagus, embalmed body of Lenin, was placed to be worshipped by the true believers who belong to the Bolshevik party. Okay, in fact, there were some few Bolsheviks who said we shouldn't do it because Lenin was an atheist. He didn't want this religious-like structure, religious structure being built, or like his body to be worshipped. But Stalin and the majority of the party insisted that it was wrong. We should celebrate his wisdom, Lenin's wisdom. He was the founder of the regime. His body should be embalmed, and he should be turned into the idol. And that's how it happened, because rank and file members, they needed some kind of the icon to be worshipped, because the Russian Orthodox Church was shut down. Remember, Bolsheviks were atheists, formal atheists, but at the same time, they need the secular icon to be worshipped. Okay, and that's what Lenin became. He became the sacred icon that was worshipped by the Bolshevik regime. His body was embalmed. His brain was preserved. There were legends spread around all over Russia that when scientists supposedly opened up his brain, they were shocked how big his brain was. You know, it's just to kind of boost his charisma in the wake of his death. Okay, about his miraculous size of brain, that it was so big. Okay, and in fact that he died from this hard thinking. He thought so much about the fate of Russia. He worked so much that eventually he killed himself by working his brain to death. Okay, he didn't rest. That was the message the Bolsheviks sent to the rest of society. Of course, his images were printed and reprinted all over Russia. And pilgrims from all over the country streamed to Moscow, to the mausoleum, this structure, to pay homage to the body of Lenin. And that's what became later the permanent tradition of the regime. So his body of Lenin, that was placed in this pyramid-like structure called Lenin's mausoleum, became the object of the pilgrimage. Okay. There were armed guards there in front of this mausoleum, and the pilgrims from all over the countries, Bolsheviks and non-Bolsheviks, who worshipped Lenin. So they had the chance to come there and to take a look at the body of the sacred hero of the regime. Anyway, unfortunately, by the way, when Stalin was taking an oath in front of the grave, Lenin's grave, before his body was placed in the mausoleum. It happened in winter, in December. Trotsky was sick with the flu, okay? And Stalin, cunning Stalin, so we will talk more about him, so, said to Trotsky, so you need to take care of your health. So he sent him away to the Black Sea resort, so people didn't see Trotsky near the Lenin coffin. Okay, so that is why it was one step of Stalin toward the political power. So to some extent, Stalin, I repeat, that was invisible before Lenin died. Okay, by the sheer fact that he took an oath of loyalty to the Bolshevik cause in front of Lenin's grave. So he linked himself to Lenin's charisma. Okay, whereas Trotsky was recuperating at the Black Sea resort. See the difference? And I repeat, Trotsky was, before Lenin died, he was the most popular man after Lenin. Okay, so let's talk about the major contenders who contested each other. First, we have Trotsky, who was an excellent speaker, a talented man. I repeat, I told you when we discussed the Bolshevik regime that he was the chief organizer of the Red Army. He was the chief executor of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. He was in charge of logistics, bringing the Red Guard, okay, mobilizing people to take over, for the Bolsheviks to take over power, because Lenin was the brains. In fact, Lenin was hiding because and a warrant for his arrest was issued. So Trotsky was in charge of all the logistics in 1917. After the 1917 revolution, Trotsky organized the Red Army to fight against so-called whites, okay, who opposed the Bolshevik regime. He was a good revolutionary organizer, but at the same time, he was not a skillful bureaucrat. He wasn't good in these bureaucratic games, okay, when backstabbing, gossiping. He was a true believer, ideologist. He was totally committed to classical Marxism, what he believed was classical Marxism, okay, and that's how he behaved. So he preferred to talk about ideas. He argued about ideas. He didn't think too much about the political power. He did like to be in the limelight as a speaker, to be in charge of things. But again, he was not a mean person, okay, who was like ready to backstab his comrade. Not a cunning person, okay. And he was a very charismatic because he was the best speaker, okay. When he was speaking, people were instinctively drawn to him, okay. He was able to draw the crowds, and that was his big asset, okay. He was a self-taught man, an intellectual who lived in Europe. He was a very cosmopolitan man. He knew European culture, Russian culture, so he was speaking languages, German language, English. He lived in the United States, by the way, for a while, before 1917. Before, like Lenin, he lived in exile in the West. Lenin lived in Switzerland, Trotsky lived in the United States. Okay, at first he lived in Austria, then he moved to the United States. So he was very much cosmopolitan, and like Rosa Luxemburg, he hated to be linked to Jews. He said that I have nothing to do with my Jewish origin. And when he was asked by one of the socialist friends, so Comrade Trotsky, what nationality you belong to, he said, my nationality is a social democrat. Okay, remember before Russian Bolsheviks renamed themselves into communists, all socialists called themselves social democrats. Okay. On the other hand, we have Joseph Stalin. Okay, Joseph Stalin, unlike Trotsky, was a very much provincial guy, parochial guy. Okay, he never traveled to other countries. He didn't know languages. Trotsky grew up in a well-to-do family of a rich Jewish farmer, actually, which was unusual. Okay, his father was a farmer, lived in southern Russia, who was able to send him to gymnasium. Trotsky didn't go to the university because he was arrested by police. He was a self-taught, but he was a good family background. Unlike Trotsky, Stalin grew up in a fatherless family. Okay, his father was a drunk who died early, was beating his mother. So Stalin hated this situation. Okay, he grew up in a we would say in a unsafe environment. I don't know how to put it. He was Georgian. He wasn't Russian. He was Georgian. There's a country called Georgia, independent country. Before it was the part of the Russian Empire. Okay, now it's an independent country in the Caucasus Mountains. Look at the map. He grew up in Tbilisi, this capital of Georgia, part of the Russian Empire. His mother was very unhappy about this miserable life they lived, and she was able, through a family friend, to secure him a spot in the Russian Orthodox seminary, so the religious school seminary. Georgians, like Russians, Armenians, they're mostly Greek Orthodox, or Russian Orthodox. It's basically the same. So he went to this religious school, the seminary, the Greek Orthodox seminary, and spent there a few years. Okay. At the same time, he was a voracious reader. He hated this religious education. He was dreaming about becoming this noble bandit, Robin Hood guy. He was fascinated with these mountaineers, Georgian mountaineers, folk heroes who robbed the rich in order to distribute the wealth among the poor. So he was very much hooked on these legends. Okay. And that's what, by the way, he was doing in his young adult years. Okay. He did excel in his seminary. At first, he went to primary school, a few classes, like 5 classes, a local parochial school. But then he goes to seminary, Russian Orthodox seminary. But for his revolutionary activities, he was late expelled from the school and joined Bolsheviks, found somehow Bolsheviks, befriended one of them, and realized that was the best place for him to be, okay, because they were underground. They loved these people like him, these Robin Hood guys, okay. At the same time, he was not, as I said, he liked to read. He wrote poetry, actually, at school and then in seminary, poetry. But at the same time, he lived in a neighborhood where the gangs were controlling streets, okay. So he had to learn how to fight, how to fight for his life in order to survive. So he developed these cunning features when he was ready to fight, to beat somebody in order to protect himself. Sometimes preventive beating, how it's done on this unsafe streets, so to speak, in unsafe areas where either you have to join the gang or you will be gang up and killed, okay. So he developed this vicious features, so domineering features. So either you dominate me or I dominate you, okay. That's the law of the streets in this unsafe area of Tbilisi where he grew up. So he learned how to fight. To put it simply, he had some intellectual traits, but at the same time, he was a street smart guy, unlike Trotsky, who was an intellectual. So Stalin was new. He was able to speak the language of the street. He was a street smart. He knew how to write poetry, and at the same time, he knew how to fight, how to beat somebody. So he joins Bolsheviks before 1917. By the way, he was one of the first Bolsheviks, and Lenin actually promoted him as early as 1912. He said, we have this wonderful Georgian. We should ask him to write a brochure on the nationalities question, because we need to instigate these nationalities, numerous nationalities of the Russian Empire against the regime. So we need to ask him to write this brochure, but he didn't have enough education. So that is why Lenin brings him, and I will tell you why Lenin liked him in a few minutes. So Lenin said we need to bring him, and that's when Stalin actually made his first and the only independent brief trip to Western countries. As I said, he hardly traveled to Western countries. So he was brought by Lenin to Vienna, and he put them together, Lenin, him, Stalin, and Bukharin. Remember, I mentioned the name of Bukharin, who wanted to promote Lenin's NEP, new economic policy. So Bukharin was a highly educated man, and he asked Bukharin, Lenin, help this guy, wonderful Georgian, to write this book, small book, brochure on our on the nationalities question. So how we should approach minorities within the Russian Empire in order to instigate them against the regime. So, and together Bukharin and Stalin wrote this brochure, and Lenin said, let's put the Stalin's name, because he is this token minority guy, and we need this token minority guy to sell this brochure, to spread it underground, to sway the minorities to our side against the regime. Okay, and it was done. You can go to Google it, Stalin on nationalities question, and this brochure will pop up. It was translated into English. Okay. Anyway, the reason Stalin liked these guys, the reason Lenin liked this guy, Joseph Stalin, was simply because he was very helpful in what? In filling coffers of the Bolshevik party. So Bolsheviks needed money in order to print their underground newspapers, in order to live the life of professional revolutionaries. Okay, remember Lenin said Bolsheviks, it should be a tightly disciplined party that unite professional revolutionaries that don't work anywhere except for the revolution. So they needed money. And Stalin, he started robbing banks. So he put together a gang of people, Bolshevik sympathizers, plus he had this experience of fighting on the streets, beating people, robbing them. Okay, so he put these skills to a good use, and together they robbed banks and provided this and gave this money to the Bolsheviks. So that is why Lenin was interested in this guy. He needed this guy. He promoted him. Okay. Anyway, at the same time, Stalin was not a good speaker. He did speak Russian, but he spoke Russian with a very heavy accent. It's a very heavy accent. And Stalin always felt insecure. Okay. I listened to him. His actual speech is recorded. You can see it on some occasions. He had to deliver speeches. Rarely he spoke in front of the people, but sometimes on some crucial occasions he needed to talk in front of the Russian people. And the way he talked, I repeat, was in a clumsy way, you know, chopped sentences and a heavy accent. Okay. And he knew this, and he felt very uncomfortable about this. And that is why he was very jealous of Trotsky, who of course never had any accent, who spoke eloquently and even was able to speak foreign languages. I'm talking about Trotsky. So Stalin was very jealous of his popularity, and that's what he did. He made sure that he would instigate the elite of the Bolshevik regime against Trotsky. Okay. And he succeeded in this. The small elite of the Bolshevik regime, about 9 people, so-called Politburo, the chief Bolsheviks, he was able to sway them against Trotsky. Stalin was indeed invisible compared to these elite people, but still he was part of this elite. The only difference that compared to other 9 people, he was not as visible as others, of course, including Trotsky, of course. What he did, Lenin put him in charge of bureaucratic work. So Stalin was put in charge of files, cadres, appointments. So this position was called General Secretary of the Communist Party. So he was a secretary, basically, the chief secretary. Under him there were a few dozens of regular secretaries which were in charge of paperwork. He was in charge of paperwork. Okay, so he was in charge of files, personnel, the chief personnel of the Bolshevik Party, chief appointments. Okay, he put together these files. He organized conferences. He organized congresses of the Bolshevik Party. Okay, they in 1920s there were frequent conferences. So he was in charge of this technical work. Okay. He sent documents when the chief Bolsheviks needed some kind of background information. They went to him, so he provided it. So the whole name of this position tells us a lot, that the General Secretary of the Communist Party. It was a technical position. It was not leadership position. It was high enough, but again, imagine a person in the, let's say, university or some big corporation in charge of HR. So that's what basically he was, in charge of HR. Human resources. That is the best way to put to give you like description of his job position. Okay. Lenin actually, before he died, he did notice that Stalin was able to consolidate a lot of power. Okay. So other people didn't see it yet, but Lenin, he noticed this, okay, especially when he had a few strokes and he noticed that how Stalin tried to isolate him. He didn't allow Lenin to communicate with other members of Politburo. So Stalin tried to grab entire communication with then dying Lenin, who tried to send messages to the chiefs of the Bolshevik regime and other members of this Politburo. Okay, and Lenin was worried about it, especially when Stalin tried to intercept messages he sent to the other members of Politburo. Okay, so in 1924, before the last stroke, when Lenin was paralyzed and died, Lenin writes a few notes, and he asked to deliver these notes to the Common Congress of the Communist Party, or Bolshevik Party. And these few notes, there were four of them, I think, four of them. It became known as Lenin's Testament. Okay, in this testament, in these few notes, which were supposed to be read by the chief Bolsheviks, by these 9 chief Bolsheviks who controlled the state, the dictatorship, Lenin actually gave characteristics to each member of the elite. Okay, he had something to say about Trotsky. He had something to say about Stalin, Bukharin, and so forth. Okay, and in fact, to be exact, he didn't praise anybody of them. Okay, he did say Trotsky was the most popular man in our party, but at the same time, he said that Trotsky likes to be in front of everybody. Okay, as eloquent speaker. Okay, at the same time, he said that Bukharin was the best theoretician of the party. At the same time, he said he is not a good administrator. But the most criticism was focused on Stalin, because Lenin, I guess, noticed that Stalin started to consolidate too much power. He said, I noted, literally he wrote, that recently Stalin consolidates so much power that worries me, and I'm not sure if he would be able to put this power to a good use. Please consider replacing Comrade Stalin with another comrade. Okay, so actually he recommended Stalin to be replaced by another chief Bolshevik. Okay, but Lenin's request to read this letter in front of the whole Congress went to nowhere, because the chief Bolsheviks were afraid that in case this letter would be read to the rest of the party, Congress of the party, and would be announced to the rest of the Bolsheviks, it would work to benefit Trotsky. Okay, because everybody among the chief Bolsheviks were afraid of Trotsky, afraid of his popularity. So they decided to shut Trotsky down, and Stalin took advantage of this situation. Okay, Stalin actually was very humble, because he, like, in this innocent way, said, okay, comrades, so I don't want to do anything, so do whatever you want. You can read this letter to the entire Bolshevik party. You can restrict it to yourself, to these 9 people. And since the rest of the leadership were very much afraid of Trotsky, they said, oh, we want to keep you, Stalin, in charge, so since you are invisible or hardly visible, so let's pick up you. And they decided to sweep this Lenin's letter under the rug, and in fact they forbade publicizing this letter, and those people who were able to publicize this letter were penalized, were thrown into prison. Okay, so this Lenin's Last Testament became the illegal document. So those Bolsheviks or non-Bolsheviks who copied this letter, they were immediately arrested and penalized, because the chief Bolsheviks were afraid that it might harm the party, but the real fear was that Trotsky might take over power. So we have this ongoing struggle. We already see here this struggle for power within the Bolshevik leadership, where the majority of leadership sided with Stalin. And in fact, they were interested in keeping Stalin because to them, Stalin, who didn't speak well, who was just in charge of the secretarial position, HR, so they thought, oh, he wouldn't be a big man. He wouldn't be like a charismatic man. So how could he hardly was able to speak Russian? Okay, he speaks in this chopped sentences. How can you expect him to be the leader? Okay, but that's exactly what happens. History shows us that the invisible people who stand behind the scenes, like gray cardinals, we call them gray cardinals. Remember Cardinal Richelieu in France, who was behind the scenes, but who was the real leader of France. Okay, and you can use many other historical examples when the shadowy figures who stood behind the scenes were able eventually to become the charismatic leaders, and that's exactly what happened in our situation. Okay, so Stalin's tactics were very simple: divide and rule. Okay, as I said, Trotsky liked to argue about ideas. He didn't try to backstab Stalin. He didn't try to be mean. In fact, some Bolsheviks who sided with Trotsky, they said that why don't you use the Red Army, because Trotsky was in charge of the Red Army, and the Red Army sided with him. But Stalin said, Trotsky said, I don't want to be another Napoleon. I'm not going to use the Red Army against another comrade. It was a big mistake, of course, because Stalin, in fact, later became this Napoleon because Trotsky refused to do it. Stalin didn't think twice about using cunning methods against Trotsky. Stalin befriended another member of the Bolshevik elite. As I said, the name of this guy was Felix Jerzinski, who was in charge of the Soviet secret police. Stalin befriended him and, in fact, asked him to keep Trotsky under surveillance, to report to him what he planned, what he said. And, of course, he used the secret information, recorded conversations of Trotsky friends against him, basically instigating people within Trotsky camp, instigating people of Trotsky camp against each other. So divide and rule. Okay. So there was a lot of personal animosity between Trotsky and Stalin that goes back not only to 1917 but before 1917, when again Trotsky was, I repeat, as a good speaker, dominated the scenes, and when Stalin was very jealous of the popularity of Trotsky. Okay, another reason Stalin was very jealous, because Stalin spent entire time before 1917 underground in the Tsarist Empire, robbing banks or publishing literature, creating these Bolshevik cells, whereas Lenin, Trotsky, and other people were abroad in Western countries. Remember, Lenin was 17 years abroad. Trotsky, similar between 60 and 70 years abroad. Okay, so Stalin had this, I would say, provincial jealousy of these well-traveled people. He thought, oh, they didn't know the life, they were away from Russia. Of course, he loved Lenin because Lenin was the chief of the regime, but he hated Trotsky because he thought that Trotsky was this cosmopolitan guy who didn't know the life of the Russian Empire, who didn't know the life on the ground, whereas Stalin spent his time underground. Okay. And in fact, there were quite a few people who sided with Stalin, who also had this suspicion of those Bolsheviks who came from abroad, this cosmopolitan Bolsheviks. Okay, so there was a lot of bad blood between Trotsky and Stalin. And Stalin and Trotsky were supported by some factions of the Bolsheviks. But on balance, we have more people. We have the increasing number of people who tended to side with Stalin, not only for certain personal reasons, like similar jealousy of Trotsky, who was a cosmopolitan guy, plus there was elements of anti-Semitism here, of course, okay, because some Slavic bureaucrats from Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, from Muslim areas, Central Asia, the newly appointed bureaucrats, of course, they came to dislike people like Trotsky, these Western cosmopolitan people. So there was bad blood, and Stalin tried to appoint these people, these new bureaucrats who owed it to Stalin, because he promoted them, because Stalin was in charge of the Bolshevik HR. So Stalin was appointing new cadre, new bureaucrats, some of them semi-educated provincial bureaucrats, okay, who opportunistically sided with the Bolshevik Revolution because it was the ruling regime. So they wanted to milk this ruling regime, and they disliked these committed ideologists like Trotsky, plus these true believers. They had the Western cosmopolitan experience, which was disliked by the provincial bureaucrats who didn't have enough education. It always happens. Bureaucrats with low education, they're always suspicious of this bright intellectuals, well-traveled. It's normal, it happens. Okay, so here we have this situation. A lot of bad blood between these two guys, Stalin and Trotsky, but it was not only personal fight for power. We have to talk about ideas. So you cannot avoid this. And that's how it was. It was also a fight of two visions of how the Bolshevik Russia, socialism in Russia, would develop, evolve into communism. So how socialist Russia would evolve into communism, how Russia would reach this bright utopian future. Okay, Trotsky, those people who sided with Trotsky, mostly, I repeat, cosmopolitans, classical Marxists, they said, we need to stick to classical Marxism, the world revolution. Russia is just the spark. It's a spark that ignited the fire of the world revolution, and we need to send the Red Army to other countries. In fact, on one occasion, Trotsky said, since our Western campaign to spread revolution in Germany, in the West failed, we need to go to Oriental countries. So let's send the cavalry division to India to smash the British, to liberate India, and India would become part of this growing socialist community, and together we would evolve into communism gradually. Okay. So we need to promote the world revolution. We need to spread revolution, East and West. He also came up with this argument that without a valid victorious revolution in the West, socialism in Russia was doomed. Okay. And of course, when he painted this doomsday scenario, it could not inspire the Bolshevik cadre, the Bolshevik bureaucracy. And remember, the Bolshevik bureaucracy was growing. By 1922, there were already 300,000 Bolsheviks, because a lot of people joined this ruling party for opportunistic reasons. Okay, 300,000, and the number was growing. And this basically reckless slogan Trotsky came up with could not arouse, could not inspire the Bolshevik bureaucracy. Okay, why? Because whatever remained from former Russian Empire, whatever Bolsheviks were able to consolidate and rename in 1922 as the Soviet Union, it was a very weak country. Civil war literally destroyed the economy of former Russian Empire. In fact, the Soviet Russia, this new socialist regime set up by Bolsheviks, was so economically, this new regime was so weak that entire Bolshevik economy, it was 1/4 of what had existed in the Russian Empire before 1913. So only 1/4 of the Russian economy, of former Russian Empire, survived the Civil War, the First World War, Civil War, and plus the war communism that also ruined the economy. So the country was in ruins. Soviet Russia didn't have enough resources to spread the revolution to Western countries or Oriental countries. There was no way. And everybody understood, majority of people outside of the Bolshevik party and inside understood this. So on the one hand we have Trotsky, on the other hand we have Stalin. Stalin actually argued that he openly said to the rank and file Bolsheviks, guys, we don't have enough resources to spread revolution to other countries. What we need to build Soviet Russia into mighty military power. And then we're going to the West and East to spread the communist revolution. So now we need to focus on building socialism in one country. And let's face a reality. Revolutionary tide goes down in the West. That's what he said. And it was fact, by the way. He was right, Stalin. Because, remember, all those socialist experiments in Europe, they failed. In fact, Stalin himself was not yet sure when he was coming up with this concept of socialism in one country. He still was one of these Bolsheviks who were convinced that they needed to promote worldwide revolution. But gradually, by just feeling what the Bolshevik bureaucracy felt, he had this guts feeling that we shouldn't go there. So he gradually started to change his tone, more and more talking about socialism in one country. Again, the reason I'm emphasizing this because I want to show to you that Stalin actually was one of these people who also participated, like Trotsky and Lenin, originally in promoting the slogan of the worldwide revolution. But since he was more, I would say, a real politics guy who had this sense of what the bureaucrats needed, okay, because he worked with cadres, he felt that the Bolshevik bureaucracy, they needed some kind of anchor, spiritual anchor. And that's what he gave them. He started talking more and more about socialism in one country. And eventually Stalin writes a small brochure called Problems of Leninism, where he argues that socialism can win in Russia without Western help. We don't need the West. We can build, if we mobilize our resources, we can win. We can build our Soviet Russia in a mighty industrial country, and then we will spread socialism. He never totally shut down the project of the world revolution. In fact, the coat of arms. I should have included this into my slides. But again, Google, if you have time, Google Soviet coat of arms. And you will see that coat of arms of the Bolshevik regime, which survived and was adopted by Stalin, it was the globe. Globe, I repeat. Globe with the hammer and sickle. Okay, on the globe. With this inscription down below, Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Again, the message was clear that eventually we're going beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, grabbing other countries, making sure they would become the members of this Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, and then it would be Global Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. So the project, I repeat, was not shut down, the project of the world revolution. It was simply put on the back burner, okay? In the meantime, Stalin said, we need to focus on building socialism in one country, since the revolutionary tide was going down, okay? So that's what gave optimism to the Bolshevik bureaucracy. At least they had something to chew on. Plus, indirectly, he massaged the feeling of nationalism. See, he didn't mean it, of course, but he already started to massage this feeling of nationalism. Those people who lived in Soviet Russia, they said, oh, we can do it on our own if we try hard. We don't need these Western people who somehow don't want to join our socialist movement, okay? So it was not only, I repeat, there were two dimensions in this fight between Trotsky and Stalin for power after Lenin died. The personal dimension, when Stalin wanted to grab the total power. Of course, he was hungry for power, he needed power, and he was acting behind the scenes. And Trotsky, who relied on his speech, on his written word, talked ideas. There was also animosity toward Trotsky among some elements because he was a Jew, although Stalin himself was not Russian either. But Stalin positioned himself, by the way, more and more, at first slightly, but then more and more, he positioned himself as a kind of a person who close to Russians, okay? So you will see it later. He didn't talk about such things in 1920s, okay? But the second dimension of this fight for power was this political projects, different political visions for the Soviet Union, okay? And Trotsky's project was not backed up by the majority of the Bolshevik bureaucrats. Why? Because it was not a realistic project, okay? So these people here, you can see Politburo. See Politburo, political bureau, okay? Politburo, it's the chief group of Bolsheviks, between 7 and 9 people, I repeat, 7 and 9 people. Eventually, under Stalin, the number of these people was 9. When Lenin started regime, it was only 7, okay? After one of them died, so a new person was appointed, co-opted, not elected, but co-opted, okay? We have Bukharin here, Kristinsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, okay? By 1926, Jerzinski died from tuberculosis. Anyway, you can see these leaders right here. Stalin was the general secretary. What Stalin did, I repeat, he used this tactics, divide and rule. He sided with some members of Politburo against Trotsky. In this case, again, don't write down the names. We don't need names. I simply want to spell them out here for convenience. So with Kamenev Zinoviev, he sided against Trotsky, but then he sides with Bukharin against Kamenev Zinoviev. Okay. He supports NEP, New Economic Policy. But then when he defeated Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky, he sides, he picks up other guys and goes against Bukharin, who supported NEP. Okay. By 1929, Stalin was able to consolidate so much power and squeeze out from power all his competitors that he became the dictator. 1929, it was his 50th birthday, so he became the dictator. So that's when we can talk about so-called Stalin's revolution. He took over the entire power by 1929. Okay. Under his leadership, gradually, I repeat, gradually, under the leadership of Stalin, the state executives, the role of the executive was diminished, but the significance of Politburo, I repeat, this group of between 7 and 9 people, increased in its power. The significance of Politburo increased, and that was the major step toward the totalitarian party state. Okay. Originally under Lenin, it worked like this. The executives worked, had some voice in economics, in politics, but the executive, ministers, prime ministers, they were supervised, so-called commissars, they were called commissars, prime ministers called commissars. They were supervised by Communist Party, by Politburo. Now, under Stalin, by the end of 1920s, then all decisions were made by Politburo and Communist Party, the branches of the Communist Party in local areas. So, Communist Party, Bolsheviks, came to control entire life from not only from ideology and politics, but down to small, minuscule economic details. So it was a huge step toward totalitarian state. And since Stalin was in charge of, as we would have said, HR, Bolshevik HR, he introduced so-called nomenclature. It's very important for understanding of the nature of the communist regime in Russia and in other communist countries, like China to the present day. It has nomenclature system. Vietnam, it's still partially decomposed communist system. Former Eastern European communist countries. Cuba, present day Cuba. Okay. In order to understand the nature of these regimes, we have to understand the nature of so-called nomenclature. Again, as I said, Stalin was in charge of HR, the general secretary, Bolshevik HR. Okay. By being at this position, by being in charge of personnel, eventually he developed this system of important appointments and less important appointments. Okay. Stalin developed the system for the most important appointments within the Bolshevik regime. Okay. The most important appointments who were carefully chosen were included in a special list of so-called nomenclature people. The word itself, nomenclature, means literally, it comes from Latin expression, the list of names. Okay, and in fact, it comes from biology, when we have nomenclature of butterflies, nomenclature of insects, or whatever. Okay, but Stalin applied it to Bolshevik appointments. Okay, Stalin singled out the most crucial positions within the Bolshevik regime. Okay, and these most crucial positions had to be occupied the most trusted people. So they had to be screened by his cronies, by his friends. Okay, and appointed to these positions. What could it be? Positions. It could be the top leadership of the secret police, like the chief of the secret police, the council of the secret police, the generals or commissars within the secret police, except junior officers who are rank and file. Another thing, the chief manager of a particular factory, let's say the chief manager of a tractor's factory, he also had to be a special appointment, okay? Or let's say original secretary of the Communist Party or Bolshevik Party, he also had to be a nomenclature person. So it means this person had to be carefully screened, an appointment by the top leadership of the Bolshevik Party. In this case, Stalin, since he was in charge of appointments, HR, he had to endorse this appointment. Okay, so he had to endorse this appointment. What was special about this appointment? What did it mean to be a member of nomenclature? To be a member of nomenclature meant that you could not be tried in a regular court, unlike the rest of the society. Okay? You could not be arrested by regular police or by the secret police. Okay, only the top leadership of the Bolshevik Party had to give permission to do something with this person. This nomenclature person had a special apartment, space apartment to live in. This nomenclature person was entitled to have a car with a driver. The family of this nomenclature person and his family had the right to go to a special store. We had special goods which were not available to the regular populace. The kids of this guy who was a member of nomenclature had the chance to go to special schools where regular girls and boys could not go. Okay, so these were the elite of the Bolshevik regimes who were entitled to particular perks. Okay, and these nomenclature people, of course, when once appointed, they created this networks of their own clients because they occupied special positions within the regime. So they cultivated the network of lower rank clients who worked for these people on the ground, okay, for these special people. So which created this feudal network. Again, it's a pure feudal network of clientele system, okay, where nomenclature people being appointed by the highest leadership of the Communist Party themselves acted as patrons for lower rank and file communist members. Okay, the overall number of these nomenclature people was about 400,000. I repeat, these crucial positions within the regime, they were listed as nomenclature positions. There was a list of these 400 positions within the Bolshevik regime that had to be nomenclature positions, so the special people. Okay, it was the elite. The expression nomenclature, Stalin actually, he hardly used this expression. He created the system in 1923, by the way, Stalin. But he hardly used this system. It was, bureaucrats did use this expression. Like, are you a member of nomenclature, where you will become a member of nomenclature. But newspapers didn't use this expression, so it was rarely used. But in social science, this word was popularized by this guy, historian Michael Waslensky, who in 1971, he was a defector who defected from Soviet Union to the West. He wrote this book called Nomenclature. It's a very exciting book, by the way. It's not a pure academic volume. It's actually imagined biography of some Ivan Ivanovich, you know, who is a member of nomenclature, who was a regional party secretary. So the book describes the one day from the life of Ivan Ivanovich, the member of the Bolshevik communist nomenclature. The book published in 1971. Okay, and after 1971, so this word became very popular in the Western mainstream. So the historians, writers started to use this expression. Okay, I repeat, it did exist before within Russia, outside of Russia, but it wasn't so widely used. But now it's used everywhere to describe the elite of the communist regimes. And later the Second World War, when we have China joining the club of the communist countries, we have communist regimes in Eastern Europe, then Vietnam, then Ethiopia, Cuba, you name them. Okay, so all these regimes, they copied the Stalinist system of nomenclature, the same thing. So Trotsky, who realized that Stalin was creating some kind of monstrous system, was very upset, but he didn't know how to fight back because he was talking about ideas. He couldn't resist the suffocating bureaucracy, because what Stalin did, he embedded into the system, political system and economic system of the new state, this bureaucracy, which was impossible to defeat. You couldn't defeat because it was embedded. Okay, you know how bureaucracy works. If you create something within a bureaucratic system, like any kind of society, in our society, in the present day society, East and West, it frequently happens that the bureaucracy acquires the life of its own. Okay, once you create something, some bureaucracy, it quickly acquires the life of its own. So that's exactly what happened. And once Stalin created this nomenclature, it became like a separate class of people, especially when you give them perks, good salaries, security. You couldn't criticize them, right? Society couldn't criticize them. You would be immediately blamed in being anti-Soviet. You could be shut down. You would be put in prison. So nomenclature members were special people. The first attempt to analyze the special class of people that we have in the communist regime, the first attempt, he also did a few times this word nomenclature, but not widely. This first attempt was made by Milovan Djilas. It's another communist dissident who was put in prison, by the way, by Joseph Broz Tito in Yugoslavia after the Second World War. Yugoslavia was a socialist country. So he wrote this book called The New Class. The reason I brought it to your attention is simply because it was the first attempt to say that the communist states, they had their own class. And that's what later became popular among supporters of Trotsky in the Western countries. Although Trotsky himself, he was not yet ready to say that these bureaucrats which Stalin cultivated so carefully, they became the new class. But the followers of Trotsky in Western countries, US, UK, Germany, they agreed with this argument that was put forward by Milovan Djilas, that in the Soviet Union, nomenclature people became the new class of oppressors who oppressed people like capitalists in the West. Okay, that's what some Trotskyists in Western countries started to argue. But Trotsky himself, I repeat, he didn't agree with this because he was one of these leaders who created this communist regime. So his argument was that yes, the damage was done, but we cannot say that these bureaucrats became the new class. The Soviet Union was becoming like a degenerate state, degenerated in the bureaucracy. So it's not completely what you're arguing. Very kind of shaky position, of course. He said, because Trotsky said, oh, we cannot put on the same level Western capitalist countries in the Soviet Union. So he was not ready yet to make this step, because he was one of the spearheads of the communist regime. Okay, if he had said this, it would have been define his original roots. Okay, it was only his followers who in 1950s and 1960s who followed Trotsky in the Western countries who actually made this step. Okay, who said cut this umbilical cord that connected them to the Bolshevik regime, started to argue in order to save classical Marxism. Followers of Trotsky started to argue, hey, look how they abuse workers in the Soviet Union. So it's a new class. So like we have capitalists in the West who supposedly exploit workers. In the Soviet Union, we have the same class of people who also exploited workers. So they tried to kind of save classical Marxism. Okay. Stalin gradually stripped Trotsky all positions. And the first, of course, position was to take away from him was the Commissar of War, or Secretary of Defense. I'm using the US expression. So Commissar of War, he lost this position. His comrades in Politburo took away this position. And then in 1928, he was marginalized, very much marginalized. By 1928, again, the secret police was used by Stalin. At the last moment, 1927, Trotsky actually, with his friends, comrades, tried to organize a demonstration against Stalin. They went to the streets in 1927, but the secret police was mobilized to shut down these demonstrations. It was, 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik coup d'etat. Trotsky supporters wanted to celebrate this 10th anniversary, but the secret police shut down this demonstration, and a lot of people were arrested. And next year, Trotsky was exiled to Central Asia, where he was put on the house arrest. But the Stalin was not yet ready to execute him. Why? Because Trotsky was a very popular person still. You couldn't simply eliminate him. Okay. In 1929, Trotsky didn't want to give up. He continued to correspond with his friends, trying to unite his people against Stalin. Intellectually, of course, he didn't create any organization. He intellectually wanted to bring together his supporters against Stalin. And Stalin hated it. He hated very much, but still the fact that Trotsky continued to be popular with many old members of the Bolshevik Party. It's only 10 years passed since the time the Bolshevik regime won in Russia. So he decides to exile Trotsky, to kick him out from Russia. So Trotsky goes abroad, but hardly anybody wants to accept him because in many Western countries and some Oriental countries, he was viewed as a dangerous person, right? He was one of the spearheads of the communist regime. Eventually, a socialist president of Mexico. Remember Mexico, those of you who studied the history of countries of Western Hemisphere, you know that there was also a socialist revolution in Mexico. It was not as brutal as Bolshevik, but the socialist government came to power, and there was a president, Cardenas, at that time, socialist in power. So he sheltered Trotsky. He allowed him to move to Mexico, and Diego Rivera, a Mexican artist who was a Trotsky sympathizer, gave him a mansion to live in, and Trotsky moved into this mansion. To the present day, by the way, if you go to Mexico City, you can see in suburbs this building where Trotsky spent his last days. But cunning Stalin actually hated Trotsky so much. Eventually, he sends the brigade of the secret police against Trotsky, and after a few unsuccessful attempts, Stalin succeeded in murdering Trotsky in 1940. There is a movie, old movie. There's a new movie, an old movie about how Trotsky was assassinated, the old French movie in 1971 with Alain Delon. Watch it on YouTube, should be in free access. It's called I Killed Trotsky. But I appreciate more the most recent Spanish movie, historically valid movie, very valid historically. Okay, it's called The Chosen, a Spanish movie, The Chosen. You can find it on YouTube. So I recommend you to watch it because it's historically well made, shows how Stalin masterminded this execution of Trotsky. When Trotsky was very dangerous to Stalin, at least that's what Stalin viewed. That's how Stalin viewed the situation, because when he moved abroad, he begins to mobilize these cosmopolitan revolutionaries who continued to sympathize with the slogan of the world revolution, who didn't want to accept Stalinist concept of socialism in one country. So Trotsky argued that this concept of socialism in one country was the betrayal of the Marxist cause, right? And technically speaking, yes, because it went against classical Marxism. But remember, Stalin never said, I'm against the world revolution. He simply said, we have to hold our horses for a while. We have to build Soviet Russia in a mighty military power. And then when we're powerful enough, we would be able to expand, to spearhead the world revolution. So it was this fight within the same camp, okay? But as you know, in any secular or religious creed, the heretics become the most dangerous people, and that's what happened with Trotsky. He became the heretic, the major heretic, who was viewed by Stalin as a dangerous competitor, because Stalin feared him, not because he had this huge network of organization. No, he didn't. The Trotskyites were very marginal people. Okay, they could not compete with the Communist International. But he was afraid that Trotsky might steal his thunder. So he wanted to be the only voice, Stalin, the only voice of radical socialism. He didn't want any competitors. That is why he wanted him to be killed. Okay. Trotsky created the Fourth International to compete with the Communist International. So he did create in France, a group of his friends created the Fourth International. Although this Fourth International was closely monitored by the Stalin secret police, hardly anything could be done by Trotskyites without Stalinist secret police knowing what they were doing. The Trotskyite organization was infiltrated by the Stalinist secret police. A lot of activists, Trotskyites, were executed, murdered by the Stalin secret police. In fact, it was a bizarre war of the Stalin secret police against Trotskyites, where hundreds of thousands of dollars were put to chase these Trotskyites across the world. Okay. Huge resources were invested into this. In fact, some of the foreign intelligence networks were rerouted by Stalin to fight against Trotskyites, who were very marginal people. Okay, so the danger of Trotskyites, like I repeat, in any ideological creed, the influence of heretics is always exaggerated. So communism was not an exception in this case. So Stalin greatly exaggerated the threat posed by Trotskyites. Okay, and eventually the scene of Trotskyism became like a token accusation Stalin used within the Soviet Russia to accuse some people into something, some like people whom he didn't like were routinely blamed in being Trotskyites. So it became like a standard accusation against people whom Stalin didn't like, even though these people never met Trotsky, never talked with them, and never shared his views. It's just a token accusation. So, and Trotsky, by the way, himself later became the a prisoner of this exaggerated campaign. When Stalin talked left and right that, oh, Trotskyites against us, there's a danger of Trotskyite movement within the Soviet Union. So he came to believe Trotsky, that he had a lot of supporters within the Soviet Russia, which wasn't true. In reality, he hardly had any supporters. It's only within this marginal faction within the Bolshevik Party, which were quickly marginalized by Stalin as early as 1920s. But the big question, and that will be the final note I want to make today, the big question was what to do next. So Stalin grabs all the power in 1929. What's next? And the next was how to build socialism in one country. And again, socialism for many Bolsheviks meant to build Russia as the mighty military industrial power. Okay, what to do with this NEP? How to build industry in Russia? And that will be our next topic for our next lecture. Thank you for your attention, and I will